All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to CrossTalk, a conversation series at the intersection of art and science. My name is Adam Weinberger, and I am a postdoc researcher at the Penn Center for Neuroaesthetics and the Georgetown Laboratory for Relational Cognition. Now, the goal of these crosstalks is to bring together artists and academics to explore questions about creativity in an intersectional way. What can science tell us about creativity? And how can an understanding of the artistic processes inform how scientists investigate them? To tackle these exciting questions, we are joined today by two people I know quite well from my work at the Penn Center for Neuroaesthetics. Dr. Anjan Chatterjee, the founding director of the center, and our inaugural artist in residence, Lucas Kelly. Anjan is a neurologist and professor of neurology, psychology, and architecture at the University of Pennsylvania, and also my boss. Over the course of his storied career, he has investigated a range of topics, including spatial cognition, event representation, neuroethics, and neuroaesthetics, the latter of which will be most directly relevant to today's conversation. His research, which is reflected in the goals of the center, uses our understanding of the brain and mind to examine the nature of aesthetic experience and investigate how people engage with and appreciate art, architecture, and the natural environment. Joining Anjan in conversation is artist Lucas Kelly, whose work has been exhibited in museums and galleries across the US and throughout Europe. He is a full professor of visual arts at Mercer Community College and the inaugural artist in residence at the Penn Center of Neuroaesthetics. So, without further ado, I am delighted to introduce our guests and kick off this conversation. So before we start, I just wanted to begin with some basic housekeeping things. So audience members should feel free to submit questions and comments throughout this talk. I'll be monitoring the chat box and we'll try to integrate some of your comments into our discussion, but there will also be some time at the end to get to things that don't come up organically. Okay. So to start us off, I thought we should talk about this concept of an artist in residence in a neuroscience lab, which is something that may be entirely novel to some folks in our audience. So then a good place to start would be to hear from each of you why this was something you were interested in pursuing and basically how this came to be.
Lucas, do you want to start or you want me to go?
Well, I guess like my experience leads us to how it came to be. So maybe it's better if you talk about why you were interested, and then I can talk about how it came to be. If that makes sense.
Sure. As Adam mentioned, we had just shortly before that initiated the Penn Center for Neuroaesthetics, and this was a novel venture for us. Even though I'd been studying neuroaesthetics for 20 plus years, it was doing this in this concerted and programmatic way was new, and trying to figure out what this actually means. And I've always been interested in adjacencies. What are things that are adjacent to what you're studying in a narrow sense? And part of that was thinking of how we can enrich our research program, inform our research program. So, for example, we have a rather prominent art historian named Jonathan Feinberg who comes to our meetings every week. We had various visitors over time, including artists, philosophers, and we were thinking about having an artist in residence. There was actually an artist before Lucas who used to come to some of the lab meetings. He was in Philly for about a year and had approached me about that. And then around that time, it was at the tail end of his sort of informal visit that Lucas and I first encountered each other, and Lucas can explain how that happened. And then fortunately, fortuitously, we also had an opportunity to apply for funds through Sachs Arts Initiative at Penn, which really gave a kind of momentum to more formally be engaged with the lab. So that was all from my end what happened before we actually got into the guts of what this would actually mean.
Yeah, so my version of the story is that I'd been dealing with the idea of memory quite a bit in my work for a few years, and I started this project sort of thinking about the fragility of memory after the loss of my father. And so I was really interested in memory narrative and how there's sort of this beautiful disaster of memory as it degrades and as we continue to try to access it. And so one day, I was a member of this artist collective called Tiger Strikes Asteroid. And at a meeting, I said, hey, does anybody know any neuroscientists? I've been doing all this stuff about memory, and I think maybe instead of anecdotally, I should probably talk to a scientist about how memory works. And in typical Philadelphia fashion, somebody knows somebody who's got a guy. And they got me in touch with a guy who sent me a number, who sent me an email. And the next thing
The
I
guy,
know,
by the way, had been a graduate student in the lab over 20 years ago.
yeah.
So,
So the next thing I know, I'm sending an email to somebody named Dr. Anjan Chatterjee at UPenn. And he said, hey, yeah, come on in. Like, let's talk about it. I'm interested in chatting about memory and what you might be interested in. And so he said, come to our lab meeting, which I immediately had this vision in my head of white coats and clipboards all over the place. And I showed up, and it was actually considerably more cordial. Though the night before, I made the mistake of Googling Dr. Chatterjee and watched his TED Talk, and I was like, "This guy's got a TED Talk." So, but it's a very good TED Talk, by the way. I strongly recommend it. And yeah, so I ended up in the lab having a conversation about some of these ideas of memory. Hung out in the lab for the day, and then we talked after the lab meeting. And we talked about what we didn't want to have and what we didn't want to have come about of an artist residency, which essentially came down to Anjan didn't want an artist to find out what was happening in people's brains when they were looking at that artist's artwork, and I didn't want to make illustrations of brain scans. Right? We wanted a true collaboration that wasn't just an illustration of a collaboration or some sort of make-believe version of being integrated in each other's domains. And so we kind of settled and kind of came together on the fact that we knew exactly what we didn't want, which is, I think, maybe counterintuitive to the way people normally set these things up. So that's kind of how it came to be.
I would just add parenthetically to that, and many people who study creativity and these kind of disciplines that are, I would regard in some ways on the edge of neuroscience. You're not studying single cell recordings and in very well worked out systems, that people are used to interdisciplinarity, but true collaborations are really hard. That more often than not, it's one person ends up helping out someone else's question, just within interdisciplinarity within science. And so trying to do something truly that not only cross disciplines, but hopefully transcended our disciplines across art and neuroscience felt like even a larger bridge, which actually made it in some ways an exciting challenge. We also did not want someone who was a very good data visualizer. That was another thing that I was clear. I did not want someone who took some of our work and made pretty pictures, pictures that were prettier than we are capable of making. So
right. And luckily, I can't do that anyway. So works out perfect.
I bet you could if you applied yourself.
What's that supposed to mean, Adam?
So then that's not what you wanted it to be. So why don't you tell us all a little bit about kind of what this very organic collaboration has kind of become, and some things that have taken place over the last 18 months or so.
Yeah, I can start with that. The first thing I thought was it was even premature to have a conversation about what we wanted to have happen. I felt like, people who know me and have been through the lab or have had contact with the lab know that I take very seriously who I want to spend time with. It's one of the big privileges of my job that I get to choose who I'm surrounded by, and which is not true for most people in most people's lives. You're stuck the way we are stuck with our families. People are stuck with the people they work with. I have the privilege of being stuck with my own mistakes when I make them. So I liked Lucas, and that was really a major criteria for wanting him in the lab. And then my thought was that he just needs to be there for a while, a couple of months, just hearing how we talk about issues, the language we use, the way, a little bit of the sausage making when it comes to designing experiments and how we go about it, before we could even have a conversation. So really having a common in the sense of he's an artist in residence in a neuroscience lab rather than me being a neuroscientist in residence in an artist enclave. So to that extent, there was a bit of asymmetry there, but having him be completely or quite familiar with how we do things, the way it works in a collaborative fashion among scientists, and the hope was that out of that, something would emerge organically that would pique his interest. And then once that happened, once there was that sort of trigger, then we could start talking about what might come out of what shape, however inchoate in the beginning it was, what shape this collaboration might take.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I found really refreshing, which is again very different than most residencies like this. What I found really refreshing was that every time we would go to meet somebody to talk about something regarding this collaboration, we both were very honest and said, and we don't really know what this is going to be yet. To the point where, as Anjan mentioned, we were lucky enough to get funding from the SACS program, and at the acceptance for our funding, I remember specifically saying to Kathy Sachs, and we're not really sure what this is going to be yet. And so the support from somebody like Kathy and the SACS program to take a chance on this and sort of respect that space that Anjan is talking about, where the true nature of collaboration is that we get embedded into each other's domains. We get to start to understand what happens in that space and react to it, as opposed to having this preconceived notion of what I'm going to do when I get into that space. That makes the interaction of the two parties like purely functional, right? If I already know what I'm going to do when I get into the lab, then kind of what's the purpose of being in the lab? Because there's no real exploration going on there, right? Because there isn't that ambiguity. And I think that we really reveled in that ambiguity, or at least I know I did. I mean, I thought that at times it was terrifying. But then because I was like, well, I don't really know how this is going to go. But then at other times it was kind of like, all right, so you are the artist in the lab. What do you think of this? And I think that ended up sort of respecting my field even more, because it was about the viewpoint of the artist, not about the artist's ability to make something. And so I found that ambiguity to be really refreshing.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess, first of all, that's just a really, part of this whole series is to think about the the shared and kind of different perspectives and experiences of the people that research kind of the artistic or creative areas, and then the people that are actually in that world professionally, and having someone in a lab that can kind of give feedback to some ideas that we might be generating. I mean, in the time that I've been in the lab, I found that to be really helpful. And I think that that's probably a shared sentiment across the other researchers. Someone wanted to know what was terrifying about, or what was uncomfortable about kind of, I think that was directed at Lucas, about kind of being in this very different world than what you might be accustomed to.
Well, so a couple of things, right? So the first thing is learning the foreign language of science, right? Most academics, we share a certain amount of dialogue, right? That makes sense. But what we talk about in the lab sometimes gets to really granular technical things that I'm holding on, and then you lost me, right? And I the papers that we read every couple weeks, I'm reading them 2 or 3 times to try and figure out what's going on, especially in the beginning, right? And so I think there's this overwhelming sense of being dropped in the middle of nowhere, to being the fish out of water, right? Then there's also this lingering part of being the expert in the field at the same time and having to respond. And by the way, at some point, we got to make something out of this, right? And so, in that ambiguity, while it was refreshing, there was also no direction of, okay, we're going to cross point A, then we're going to get to point B, and then the end result is going to be in this space. It was just kind of really fluid, right? And so that could be terrifying, right? This like sense of the unknown on the other side of this experiment.
So that's kind of the one way of you, Lucas, kind of situating yourself into the world of the researcher. Now, maybe this would be a good time to kind of transition to talking about one of the projects that did come out of this residency, and this is the aesthetic immersion project, where it kind of got flipped on its head, and now the lab was kind of more in your world. So do you want to let people know what that project was? Because I think it's a really, really great example of what can come of these kinds of collaborations.
Sure. Maybe before we get into the details of it, maybe Anjan, you might want to give a little perspective of where the lab was when the pandemic hit, and sort of where everybody's heads were at the time, being somebody who was like actually speaking to all parties at once.
Yeah, so the pandemic, I mean, what was true for us, I'm sure, was true in various ways for just about everybody on this call, which is that it was a shock. It was a shock to the system. It was something unpredictable. It was a little unclear how our science would proceed. We are an experimental lab, and that experiments can't, at least direct experiments with people completely shut down. The lab was at that point, every lab goes through different evolutionary phases where there are transition periods and periods where labs come together. We're in Philadelphia, there's a very nice Quaker term sometimes referring to meetings being gathered, and by gathered meaning that all of the parts fit together and in a way in which the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And we were in a pretty good place with the lab at that time. There are always little hitches here and there, as is the nature of human relations and the sort of stresses of having to produce as being in a science lab. But we were in a pretty good place, and all of a sudden there was this major event that fragmented us and balkanized us. And I'm a big believer in the power of presence and the power of being in each other's presence. And that became vastly attenuated by virtue of having Zoom calls. And so it presented a kind of problem, which is how do we, what kind of mechanisms, what could we do to kind of keep the lab intact and connected mostly across each other? And this was really Lucas and Eileen Cardillo, who's the associate director. This was their brainchild. I confess that I was a little skeptical in the beginning because I was wait, people. This is an ideal time for people who are not sick, who now have the time to write the papers that I spend all my time harassing them.
Get down to work.
Right? This is the time. Let's do it. But clearly, this was I was still working off of the momentum of how we do things before the pandemic, and which again, this is why it's useful to have people around who pull you back from your own blind spots. And in this case, both Eileen and Lucas were instrumental in doing something which he will now describe, which I think was immensely valuable and not my initial instinct to engage in.
Yeah. So and to be honest, Eileen deserves the bulk of the credit for the idea. So Eileen and I, through discussion, said we need to sort of mark this moment. We need to do something to take a step back and engage in the humanities, and not just keep putting our head down and doing work, but to give each other a moment to share and to breathe a little bit. And so we kind of flipped the script. We sort of turned the nature of the collaboration in reverse order. And so instead of me being embedded in the lab became embedded in my domain. And so I developed a series of prompts, and we coined this the Aesthetic Immersion Project. And so conceptual prompts, formal prompts, no prompts whatsoever. We had a list of ideas, and the overriding theme was we're going to put your science aside for a little bit. And we're going to spend, I think at first, Eileen and I were like, we're going to spend a week. Nobody does any work. You just, just shower yourself in the arts for a week. And then Anjan was like, whoa, everybody pump the brakes. So we said, okay, maybe we do a few days where we put aside our science. We focus on something that we consider to be aesthetic. And in that thing that we consider to be aesthetic, there was a really broad way of defining that. It could mean cooking. It could mean writing science fiction. It could mean playing your trombone or writing poetry or trying to make drawings. And we had time to do that, time to just say, okay, this is the way this is going to work. And then I think most importantly, we all came together and we shared. And this was very different for me, by the way. There was a level of vulnerability of everyone who was involved. Some people felt very uncomfortable sharing in this tight-knit group that they were so familiar with. Even as familiar as they were, they felt uncomfortable sharing some of their feelings about what they had made, and were sending me evidence of what they had made privately to have conversation about. But we got together, we talked about the context in which we were making art, music, writing science fiction, doing all these things, writing poetry, and the way it was affecting us. And so we really put to task the question that the lab promotes quite a bit. What is art good for? And this was a moment where we tested that. And we it was pretty phenomenal for me because I'm so used to talking to art students about what they're making, and they know that they're going into a critique. But for me, this wasn't about a critique, right? This wasn't a class where I was making sure that we were accomplishing certain goals before we headed on to the next concept, right? This was a time where I had to take a step back as an educator and say, okay, this isn't about teaching, this is about sharing, this is about experience, which theoretically is what I'm also supposed to be teaching. Right. And so it was definitely sort of an eye-opening experience for me to try and manage these feelings, and some of the things that came out of that immersion were pretty special.
Yeah, I think the point about the vulnerability is really interesting, and I think that is definitely something that people that are not, typically making art are not necessarily accustomed to. If you get a grant rejected or a paper rejected, sure, that hurts, depending on what you've invested in it, but it's not like they are rejecting, your creation of your like truth in a way that can be very different if someone's saying, put yourself into this art, and then you put yourself into the art, and then someone has criticisms about what that is, where that feels much more personal. And I think that, and you guys can speak to this more, I think that's a big distinction between kind of the evaluation process that a researcher might be used to versus an artist or someone, in some sort of creative field.
Yeah, I think I want to be clear that especially people early in their career have a lot of their identity invested in their science. And so it does feel personal when papers get rejected or grants get rejected. And so I don't want to minimize that aspect of developing as a scientist. I think there is a distinction worth laying out, which is the difference between a first person and a third person perspective, which is that when we are doing science, we adopt a third person perspective, right? It is not about my journey into whatever I discovered. Lucas in the beginning of the conversation mentioned my TED Talk. That just an interesting anecdote about this is the week before they invited me to give a talk, I had a lab meeting where I was emphasizing this point to people in the lab, which is your process, while it's enormously important to you, nobody else gives a shit about it, right? Which is like when you are writing, right? We don't care about your process, right? So you have to adopt this third person perspective. I mean, you can tell your grandmother about it, your partner about it, and, your close friends and stuff. But really, when it comes to what we actually produce, and the irony is that days after that lab meeting, what the TED people wanted me to do, and this is, I mean, they've got a formula, which most people know if you watch enough TED Talks, is start with a personal anecdote of how you got to this thing. It was right after I finished saying nobody cares, right?
Right.
So, but there is this, I think, this first person versus third person distinction, which is in art, because you are revealing something in a first person way. There is an added layer of vulnerability there, or a different kind of vulnerability that especially we are not in the sciences. You develop your professional armors. I mean, at this point, I don't even blink when papers get rejected. One of the things I tell postdocs is that until your paper is rejected 3 times, don't even think about it. But this is very different when, as you say, you're bearing yourself. And so I think the level of vulnerability and the nature of the vulnerability is different.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's also, so primarily when an artist is submitting something, first off, our world is rejection, right? We are rejected far more than we are not, that, very, very rejected, right? And so you do build up that armor too. And actually, in a conversation recently, we were talking about feedback, right? And the one time I got rejected from a show and they actually sent me criticism about my piece, and I was like, what? You don't you don't tell me why you didn't take the piece. You just don't take it and you move on, right? And I think
But
that
just to interrupt is so different for us, which is
right.
when, especially foundations, if you apply for grants for foundations, if they reject you, it's just a form letter saying, no, we don't want you. But they don't tell you why. And I find that incredibly annoying. Well, give me some reason. So
Yeah. I think it's you want the rationale, and I want to be able to say, well, maybe they just didn't understand it. But when they send me a piece of criticism, then I can say, you don't know what the hell you're talking about, like, and so, and I want to, again, I want to sort of be in that ambiguity a little bit more. This idea of the first person and third person, I think also it's important to note, generally speaking, I'm a solo act, right? And you're a band, right? And so when you're getting rejected, it's this blanket of space that's being rejected, this group of people that all work under this one umbrella. When I'm getting rejected, I'm getting rejected, right? It's my thing. We say a lot. Oh, you got to put yourself into it. Personal experience. How do you identify with what you make? And I think that for artists, a lot of times is where we are able to set aside the process from the product, right? The process for many artists, I'm not going to say that this is a way that we all work, but I know for me and for a lot of artists, the process is one thing, and that's where the making of the art sort of serves the purpose for us, is through this process, right? And then we get to the other side of the finished piece and it goes to exhibition. And then that's where the viewer has the opportunity to engage in their own process of the creation of narrative, right? But they don't necessarily have to be a part of my narrative, right? They get to have their own experience with this artwork. And so that separation between the narrative that exists through the process and the narrative that exists through the viewer's experience, that separation is a safety, right? That's a buffer zone that I think a lot of artists really need to have, because then we can say, hey, listen, this served its purpose for me. If you don't want it for that other purpose, that's fine, right? And I think because we're a solo act, it's essential for a lot of people, because we don't have the buffer of the big team, the et al, right? By the way, I learned that in the lab, that et al thing. Didn't know that before. See, it's what these residencies are about, et al.
Yeah, we've succeeded. Well, Adam is looking, I assume you're scanning for questions. Let me ask Lucas something, which is sticking with the aesthetic immersion. There was also another inversion, which is I usually run lab meetings and I have a kind of a formulaic way in which I do it. But this was one meeting where it was your show. What was that experience like? And it's not something I've actually asked you before, so I'm curious about the answer. This is not something I know what you're going to say.
Yeah, so it was a little nerve-wracking for a couple different reasons. All right, so the first is that we were meeting kind of like this, right? We weren't meeting in the familiar space of being around the table. The second is that when I run that show normally, whether it's in an undergrad class or when I've taught, been a guest in grad classes or something, doing guest critiques or visiting artists or something like that, it's expected that I'm going to turn some screws, right? It's expected that we're going to have critical dialogue, And while, I like to think of myself as being a hard ass in certain places and being nurturing in other places, there was a space where I wasn't sure how I was supposed to be, which side of that I was supposed to be on for this, right? I knew that there needed to be some rigor, right? Because this was going to be something that potentially we were going to write about, or potentially we were going to share with, with the SACS program, or, so I had this feeling of there needing to be this academic rigor, but at the same time, I had gotten so close with the people in the lab that I also just kind of wanted to be there and try to orchestrate a space where everybody could, be open. You combine that with the fact that this was so foreign to the scientists who study aesthetics, right? The people who are in the lab, who are trying to make clear to the rest of the world that through science we can, understand that art is good for us. As soon as we asked them to put their science down and start doing art, they were like, "Okay, so hold on one second. How much time? What's expected of me? Is this okay for me to do? Is this okay for me to do? I just need some parameters, right?" And so there was also this feeling when we were going about the sharing process, when we were coming back to the lab to sort of talk about what we had done, that some folks were kind of like, "I don't even know if I did this right." And I got a lot of people who made comments like that, to the point where one person told me, "It's clear that I've done," in a private email, "It's clear that I've done this wrong. I will be redoing this, and I'll send you images of,"
My homework.
yeah,
I'm gonna say revise and resubmit.
yeah. And I was like, "Hey, listen, if this was a meaningful thing for you, right, we didn't have expectations about what you were going to make. And so since we didn't have expectations about what we were going to make, and then the parameters of how we were going to go about this, and the level of rigor versus nurturing versus, paying attention to this moment versus something that we were going to package up and share with, funding agents, like, that was the hardest part of the whole thing, looking somebody in the eye that I've spent, at that time, a great deal of time with. And am I supposed to be critiquing you even though I've essentially taught you nothing? Right? It was tough. And by the way, most people did not follow any of the prompts that I wrote. So pages of prompts, all these things that I wrote out. And I don't think one person actually went about doing any of them, which was kind of great because it means that they generated their own projects. So does that answer your question, Anjan?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's an interesting role that you had, which is in some ways, being part therapist, part evaluator, there are multiple roles embedded in that. Those are in some ways made a little more explicit. Those all exist when you're a PI in a lab, but a little more in a more how should I put this? In a less explicit way, and different PIs probably take those different roles more or less seriously, depending on their own proclivities and how they choose to run a lab and the kind of culture that they wish their lab to have. But in this case, it was very explicit. People are, sharing both to the group and to you privately things that they might not otherwise share. So there's a bit of a, the artist mentor as there's a confessional quality to it that don't always get when you're a PI. Although it happens more often than you might think, but this was very targeted.
Yeah, and by the way, that mixture of roles that you're describing, educator, therapist, confidant, friend, those things frequently are part of my job as a community college professor in visual arts, right? And we've talked about that quite a bit, to the point where I'm not only those things, but I'm also participating in social work at times. And so I think that was also odd because I'm so familiar with wearing all those hats, but there's a familiarity with the context that I do that. And so now taking those roles out of context and dropping those roles into this other context, that disrupts that shakes up the apple cart a little bit, you know,
Yeah.
and makes it even more unfamiliar.
So we have a bunch of questions now coming in. I want to just throw a few up here. So one person wants to know, getting back to this discussion between like people want to see the process versus the product, where would you place creativity in there? Like, do you think creativity falls in kind of I'm interpreting this person's question, but basically like the actual process of getting to an endpoint, or kind of is it the culmination of that, I guess, is what this person would be asking.
Well, I mean, I can offer my take on that, which is not dissimilar than how people who study creativity think about various processes. So it's fairly common to think about both divergence and convergence. And at least in this morning session, which I sat in on, I think people seem to be in agreement that while some aspects of divergent processes are an important ingredient, they're not synonymous with creativity. And for me, I think they both coexist. So, on the one hand, while you have to diverge, you also have to converge and close. And if you don't do that, it just becomes kind of, loose and sort of, it's a fun exercise. But I think both, starting, widening, expanding, and then converging and closure is important, right? I think because part of the closure is also what you choose to ignore, what you choose to take out, what you choose to not present, to bring it down. I think, to me, those are important. Those are important for, those are important when we do our science, which is what to present, what not to present, what questions to ask, what questions not to ask. I think those apply to art as well, which is trying to figure out, all of the iterations of what you do, and all the editing and trying to pare it down. I think this applies to writing. As people in the lab know, I'm fairly obsessive about writing, and that having, paring down to the simplest version that communicates complicated ideas is still the ideal. So in that sense, I think there are certain commonalities, at least that I see, in both the process and the product, because without the convergence, you have no product.
I would agree with that. And I would also say that from the maker standpoint, it's an odd thing for me to talk about creativity in general, right? Something that I think when a lot of people meet an artist, that's the first thing that they think of. And creative is like one of the last things that I would describe myself as. And I think a lot of times because it's kind of second nature, right? A lot of times I don't even think about the fact that my job is to make these things that don't exist in the world, right? That's what I want to make, things that don't exist in the world already. And so that's inherently like a creative thing to do, right? That's a creative journey. But I don't ever say like, okay, like let's get up, we gotta be creative today, right? So the process, I think, through the exploration of what we make, through the exploration of the process, I think we engage in creativity in a way that's second nature, right? When I release a piece into the world and it goes into an exhibition, and I talk to somebody about what they think about a piece, I do recognize when someone is having a more creative viewpoint on the work than I had initially thought when I was making something. But generally speaking, my work is deeply personal, and I revel in the ambiguity of reductive abstraction as a way of allowing somebody else to have their own personal experience. So when I get to hear someone tell me the narrative of my piece, that sounds like a pretty creative part of the product, right? But they're engaging in the process for them, the process of being a viewer. So I think it's hard to compartmentalize. Over here in process, this is the way we think about it. And over here in product, this is the way we think about it, because that inhibits the role of the viewer as participating in their own process of being a viewer, right? The product itself is a catalyst for a different kind of experience, right? Just because.
So let me ask you a question on that, because it's something I've been thinking about, and if this has come up in conversations for me, and I don't know where I stand on this, which is the notion of agency. So when you say this is personal, right, whether it's something about your life that you're putting out there, but people might have completely different takes on it that has nothing to do with your motivations for it. And there's a way in which what I'm hearing you say is it doesn't matter. They're engaging in a process, and that's perhaps just as valid. And so the what that triggers for me is, what is the role of, as a viewer, not as a maker, what is the role for the viewer in their notion of the agency, that there is a mind behind this artwork? Is that relevant? And the way this becomes a question that is timely is the direction where this sort of digital art, computer generated art, where there is a maker in the sense that someone created a program, but it's very unconstrained, and then something comes out of it, and maybe there's some selection along the way. But one could anticipate, taking that kind of machine learning algorithmic approach, that there will be, there might, that the human touch gets more and more attenuated, and something gets produced that we might want to call art, or, since nobody knows how to define art regardless, but the question is, what is the value of that? And so again, I'm really stretching from your comment to the broader question of how should we value agency in the creative process and the art making process?
How should we value agency in the creative art making process? So I think to sort of roll back to where you started, it's my own personal opinion, and again, I'll say not all artists share this opinion, but for me, it does its job when I'm making something. And I make it in a way so that it can have another life after me, right? When someone else participates in the narrative and it has another life for them, right? I think that that's an opportunity to create a greater gift, right? And I think that, whether or not they understand my exact narrative is irrelevant. To a certain degree. I think it's relevant if that's the way that they want to engage in the piece. And I'm happy to sit down and talk about anything that I make with folks. I'm happy to give them documentation. I'm happy to talk to them about why and where things come from, right? But I also feel as if it's really important for us to create experiences that are not didactic. Right. It's important for us to allow for other people to generate their own experiences, to have that agency as a viewer. Otherwise, all we're doing is preaching, right? And then, so where is the shared notion of the human experience? All I'm doing is telling you about the human experience, about one individual's human experience. And if it's just going to be about me, why even bother hanging it up in a museum, right? Because if it's just going to be about me, I might as well just hang it up in my house or burn it when I'm done, right? There's a sensibility of like the process being something greater than just masturbation, right? And so like I'm not interested in that. I'm not interested in it only having an existence with me. I'm interested in creating this catalyst, creating this trigger for someone else to be able to go ahead and take it and have their own experience if that's what they want. But if they want to get into the details, and by the way, I think that there's something to be said about someone who wants to understand the background of the artist in a way that is also having their own experience, because their experience is about research, their experience is about history, their experience is about understanding someone else's point of view in that way where they can get to the pure essence of where this thing came from so that they can connect dots, right? So I think that, there's value in both of those approaches. And I'm, not going to be somebody who's going to say it has to be read this way. And that's, by the way, something that I kind of released over time. I spent a lot of time in critiques in graduate school as somebody would start to say something. I'd be like, no, that's no, you're reading this all wrong. This is not what this is about. And if you ask my students, I tell my students a lot of times about my first critique in art school versus the way my critiques in community college went. So like I was a community college kid, and I heard every critique I had was like, oh, it's good, I like it, oh, that's awesome. I go to art school and all of a sudden I'm having a real critique. People are talking about what's working and what's not working. People are making references that I don't understand. And the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I arched my back and I gave it back to them. You don't get to talk about these things this way. I was this close to being like, listen, man, I'm from Jersey, right? and so so I think what I learned over time is that you got to separate yourself from the piece at a certain point. Otherwise, it's going to drive you crazy, right? It can't just be about you. There's no value in that except for to keep it in your bedroom, right? Keep it in your living room. So if it's only going to be about you, what's the point? Yeah. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Do you think, to make it in its most concrete form after that very thoughtful and eloquent response, is there a future for computer-generated art?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I don't, we talk about this again in one of my classes, Walter Benjamin's Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, and the idea of the aura of the artwork, right? And I've talked about this in lab too, right? We're looking at these museums, these like virtual representations of a museum, and I'm saying, listen, these are pictures of paintings, these aren't paintings, right? There's an experience of being in front of a painting, of seeing its depth, its texture, its scent, right? The context of people being around you, right? All of these things. What's the architecture like? I think that there is an aura to the physical object. And the question I pose to my students a lot of times is, what's the aura of the digital object? Right? I think this is something we need to kind of figure out, because it's not like this is going away, right? And I'm not about to denigrate a maker because they're choosing a specific medium, right? I think that is an early modernist approach to thinking about art making. I had a painting instructor who would only talk about paintings when he taught art history. He used to quote the famous line, a sculpture is the thing that you bump into when you back up to look at a painting, right? That's this early modernist viewpoint of media. And I'm not about to be the 21st century of that, right? I'm not about to say, listen, you got to make it by hand for it to have an aura. It can't, how is that supposed to exist in the digital realm? But I think that that's a really interesting question for artists in the 21st century of, okay, we're exploring these fields. First, where is the aura? How does it exist? And second, does it matter?
Earlier I was talking about adjacencies, and periodically I do these deep dives into just reading stuff that's not directly related to what we're doing, and every few years, and I'm in the midst of that right now, also doing a deep dive into reading about evolution, and particularly the broader question being, for cultural aspects, how we as biologic organisms, what is the relationship of the evolution of us as biologic organizations and the cultural products that we make? But in that, there is this, very core idea in evolution of, ultimately sometimes very exquisitely, beautifully designed biology without a designer, right? Without an agent in that. So I was just reading a whole chapter on the kind of amazing mechanisms of echolocation in bats and how complicated this is, purely from an engineering standpoint. But this idea that this can happen without intentional design has gotten me to thinking about whether these kinds of evolutionary, there are these, and again, I'm by no means a computer scientist, so I'm just going to spit out words that I don't really know the meaning of, but these kind of computer algorithms that are based on evolutionary principles, where one could imagine very beautiful iterative designs coming out of that look beautifully designed without a maker. And I don't know what I think about that. I'm asked these as genuine questions. Anyway.
So what I would say to you is, does the lack of maker reduce the impact of the existence of that object, that beautiful design? And I mean, I think we can all appreciate beauty in nature, and we can all appreciate, echolocation in bats, right? And I think that requiring, when we talk about the arts, all of a sudden it has to be about there being a maker for us to gain some sort of value in it. Well, that's counterintuitive to exactly the way we experience it in nature. So why do I have to know about the maker for me to have the experience with an art piece of any type, when I'm totally okay with that elsewhere, right? Oh, great. And so then he leaves, right? He's like, never mind this guy. But I mean, I think that it's an interesting point, right? Like, why does it matter to a certain degree, right? We accept it in other spaces. Why does it matter in the arts specifically?
Yeah. Well, Anjan just left. I think he'll be back, but we're kind of like right at the end. But maybe I'll just ask you one question, Lucas.
There he is. Voice of God.
I'm afraid to say anything.
I am the maker.
I'm not sure what's happening.
I don't know. Well, Lucas, let me ask you one final question, and then I think we'll probably head out. Just the one that's gotten the most votes here. So curious about what's the most surprising thing you learned about your immersion in the lab, not about neuroscientists and their process, but about the brain, and how did that knowledge influence you personally or in your art?
Wow. Okay. What was that?
I said to put you on the spot.
Yeah. So it can't be about neuroscience.
I think not about like the neuroscientist as a profession, like just actually about like the brain and things that we've studied and how that has changed, your art or you personally.
I think that now it's me.
I think you're good now.
Now it's you. All right. So I think that I don't know that I can answer that question in a way that's going to make anybody happy, to be honest. I think that we've looked at so much broad information in the lab, from facial anomalies to aesthetic engagement to architecture to and like I don't know that anything has really spoken specifically to what I actually wanted to look at when I joined the lab, which was memory, right? And I think that it's been more valuable than if I had just focused on memory, because I was able to understand a lot more about how the brain processes aesthetic experience um, outside of that narrow parameter of what I wanted. So it was a much more generalized notion of understanding the brain than specifically how it spoke to what I was making at the time. What I will say is, more than as a maker, the thing that has been really rewarding is how it's changed my my focus as an educator. So as I talk about the things that I've kind of always talked about, like when I teach color theory, I talk about color psychology. When I talk about composition and design, whatever happens in the lab, I'm trying to weave that in as interesting topics for my students to grab a hold of. And my students generally are not privileged enough to have access to things like UPenn. And so for me, that's been actually the thing that's been most changing. Not really me in the studio, um, but more me in the classroom um, than anything else. So, so the ability to sort of speak about foundational things in a color and composition class and relate them to the brain, so that my students get an understanding of kind of this the holistic nature of all of these things coming together. I think that's been the most rewarding part of being in the lab thus far, other than friends I've made and the projects I'm working on, right? But like we're more interested in sort of the ancillary stuff, right? We're not talking about the real guts of what we're doing. Right?
Well, great. I think this is probably as good a place as any to end this conversation. I think this has been great. We have some good feedback in the comments. So a lot of questions we haven't gotten to, of course, is always how it is, but I would assume that you both would be open to, future, talks if someone wants to send you an email or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, we were good for about 59 minutes and then the wheels fell off. So we'll just leave it at that.